Happy Easter. So at Easter, we celebrate Jesus' death and resurrection, his greatest suffering and his greatest victory. And on Easter Sunday, we generally focus on the victory and the joy. And my message started out to be a happy, fluffy little one, and then God took it into a totally different direction. So we're going to stay with the theme of suffering for a little bit longer. We will focus on the victory as well. But so we'll stay with the theme of suffering, and if you're disappointed with that, take it up with the big man upstairs. So no one really wants to suffer. We wisely avoid it as much as we can. And Jesus didn't really want to suffer either. He said, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. But he did accept his path, and his suffering had a positive outcome, had a redemptive outcome. Jesus gained, can we have the slide, please, the first one? For one, Jesus gained victory over death. Jesus was raised from the dead, and he will never die again. Death no longer has any power over him. So that's number one. Number two, Jesus was made perfect through suffering. And that's Hebrews. Do I have the right click? No, the other one. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. And just as we experience suffering with Jesus, we also will experience eternal life with him. Next one. I want to know Christ and experience the mighty power that raised him from the dead. I want to suffer with him, sharing in his death, so that one way or another I will experience the resurrection from the dead. So Jesus' suffering had a redemptive outcome. And my question this morning is, does our suffering somehow also have a positive outcome or a positive aspect to it? And does it make us better? Maybe not quite perfect like Jesus, but maybe just a better version of ourselves. The general consensus, and that's not Christian, is that yes, suffering, there are positive aspects in suffering, and they are good for you to, like you can't evade it, it's going to happen anyway, but there are some positive things about it, like it teaches you things. It teaches you to be compassionate and maybe more resilient and to accept reality. The Bible also mentions positive outcomes to suffering. And there are especially, or mainly, three things that keep coming up. So I just want to focus on these 3 points that the Bible mentions. And then I actually want to have a look, is that true for ourselves when we suffer? Do those points apply to us as well? I can't remember if I actually put that up. Oh, I did. The first one is suffering teaches us to rely on God and to trust that he is somehow at work for us in what is happening. Trials teach us to trust God because really, eventually we come to the end of our tether, of our strength, and then we really have no other option but to rely on God. Paul and his co-workers experienced the same thing. Paul said, "We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure," even though it says, isn't there a Bible passage that says, you shall not be tempted beyond what you can endure? But here you go, beyond our ability to endure. And we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely on God, who raises the dead. Next point that comes up in the Bible is we share in suffering and in eternal life with Jesus. So Jesus suffered, which means he can understand what we're going through when we suffer. He suffers with us. So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same testings as we do, yet he did not sin. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. In Philippians Yeah. And Philippians just explains how, just as we suffer with Christ, we will also be raised to life with Christ. I want to know Christ and experience the mighty power that raised him from the dead. I want to suffer with him, sharing in his death, so that one way or another I will experience the resurrection from the dead. And the third point, suffering changes us. It prepares us for a purpose. So God can use suffering to turn us into people that have strength of character, that have maybe hope, that have more resilience. Romans 5, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation, and it also gives us compassion, so we actually understand when other people are going through the same thing. 2 Corinthians, he comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they're troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. Okay, so that's all great, and it's the Bible, so we believe the Bible, what it says. But I want to ask the question, can you honestly, confidently say that when you've had the greatest pain in your life, it's been such a wonderfully enriching experience for you? I came across this testimony. Her name is called Rose Price, and she's a Holocaust survivor. And she, from the age of 11, she spent 6 years from 39 to from 39 to 45, so that's 6 years in concentration camps. And when I was reading, like she's written a book, when I was reading her book, those 3 points actually came up in her testimony, just maybe not exactly in the way we would imagine. And so I want to have a look at her story and just investigate a little bit, like what the Bible says here, how does it actually apply? Now, Rose Price, I'll just give you a little bit of a background. She grew up in Poland with her dad, died young. She had a brother and 2 sisters and a mum, and they lived with the grandparents, like it was a loving family. They were an Orthodox Jewish family, and they held on to Jewish traditions. And she said from an early age on, she experienced hate and anti-Semitism. She says as kids, when they would walk to school, the Polish children would throw stones, would call them names. Then she had an experience when she was 8. She was walking past a Catholic church, and the priest came running out, holding a cross, yelling at her. He knocked her down, and then he slammed her over the head with the cross, shouting, "Christ, kill her." And that's an 8-year-old girl. Then in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and things became worse. Within a short time, the kids were told at school to come outside, and then they were told never to come back to school. Not long after, their homes and all of their possessions were taken, and they were driven to a ghetto, and there the family was put to work at an ammunition factory. Shortly after that, Rose and her sister, older sister, 2 years older, Sarah, they were separated from the family, and they were brought transported into their first concentration camp. And then she spent the next 6 years in 5 different concentration camps. She says they had to work 18-hour days, yeah. Their daily food consisted of a thin slice of bread and a cup of lentil soup, and they knew it was lentil soup because it was hot, and occasionally they saw lentil float by. And she says, of those days, isolated horrors stand out. There were beatings, tortures, daily executions, experiments. She explains a couple of things in her book. I won't go into any detail, but there are also things that happened to her that she has never shared with anyone, not even with her sister, and she's not planning to. I want to have a look at the first question. Did suffering teach Rose to rely on God? Did she believe he was at work for her? Now remember that Rose didn't believe in Jesus, but she believed in Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. And so this one time they were all lined up, and she was called out of her line to stand in the other line, and she knew it was the bad line. And the bad line was, everyone would be marched off and shot. And she said she was standing there, and then she felt a tug on her sleeve, and the guards were currently preoccupied with something else. So someone tugged her sleeve, pulled her out of the line. She never saw who it was, and so she ran off to the barracks and hid in a corner the entire night until the next day. And that night, she said, she vowed to herself that she would survive, she would not die. She also came to the conclusion that if she were to survive, she would have to do it on her own, because if God allowed that kind of misery they were in, he obviously wasn't her God, certainly not a loving God for her. And so she decided there really was no God, or no loving God for her anyway, even though her mother had told her all about God. And so she vowed to herself she would make sure she would survive and her sister would survive. When Rose and Sarah moved to a different camp at one point, they happened to meet their aunt, like their mother's youngest sister, Dora, and they thought, surely, this is wonderful. We have a family member here. Surely with a family member, that member will look out for us. And they discovered that their aunt had a stash of food stacked under her bed, but she never shared any of it. And she says, it wasn't that surprising, because it didn't take that much for a person to betray another just for the promise of food, because they were just so hungry and so skinny. And at one point, she too, like Rose too, was enlisted by a Nazi officer to spy on the others, and she did. So what did suffering teach Rose? Taught her to rely on herself, and that God didn't really care about her. And it just made me think that when real suffering and pain hits us, are we a little bit the same? Where you kind of think like, God, where are you? Do you actually really care? And we do start to rely on ourselves. The second one, did Rose feel that Jesus shared her pain? Now, one day Rose was working on a machine, like working long hours, and the machines weren't maintained. The Nazi officers didn't really bother with that, so it exploded, and she had shrapnel embedded in her legs and in her back. And two fellow prisoners pulled her away, because if any Nazi guard had seen that, an injured prisoner isn't worth anything. You're shot on the spot. So they pulled her away, bandaged her up, and then she said she found a corner to hide bravely. And she said, amidst all the pain and the hunger and the filth, because they didn't have a chance to clean up, she said she actually felt like the vermin that they said she was. And at that moment, she turned to God and she said, God, if you're there, can you please tell me you're there, and can you please tell me you love me? And she said she waited, and there was nothing. And later one night, her sister said to her, it's Yom Kippur tomorrow, and Yom Kippur is a very holy day for the Jews. It's a day of repentance. So her sister said, I actually want to fast. That day, they happened to get an extra portion of food. I'm pretty sure that was deliberate. And Rose said other prisoners wanted to fast too, but she was like, why would I fast for a God that allows such misery? Why would I believe in him? Towards the end of the war, early 1945, Rose and Sarah were transported to Dachau, which is a town 10 kilometers from where I grew up, so I know Dachau quite well. We'd go for coffees. And I know Sarah and Andrew, they went and visited Dachau a few years back when they were traveling, and I think Sarah couldn't even make it all the way through. It's a memorial now, the barracks. You can see photos, watch videos, and it's a lot to take in. So anyway, that's where they were. And a large banner across the entrance of one of the camps, I can't remember if it was Dachau or another one, but it said, you killed our God, Jesus Christ, now we kill you. The Nazi guards told her over and over again that she killed Jesus, and that's why Jesus actually put her in the concentration camp and wanted to kill her. And she said, like, the guards, they did horrible things throughout the week, but on Sundays they would go to church with the families as if nothing had happened. And so Rose hated her captors, obviously, and she hated Jesus because she thought it's Jesus' fault that this is happening to me. After she was freed, she wanted to go and burn down all the churches because she said somehow she thought burning down the churches would eliminate Jesus and stop all the hateful acts that were done in his name. So did suffering teach Jesus that Jesus shared her pain? No, I taught her that it was really Jesus' fault that she suffered. Last point, and the third one, did suffering change Rose and prepare her for a purpose? Now, at that time in Dachau, towards the end of the war, she realized that she would never see her family again, that they were long dead. And she said she cried long and hard, and then until there were no tears left, and then she was done. And she said she kept all her emotions inside, and her heart grew colder and colder, and she felt dead inside. That's her words. And after they were freed, the prisoners, like generally, they didn't even think about freedom. What they thought about was revenge. All they wanted to go and murder those people that had done these terrible things to them. After the war, Rose settled in America eventually. She got married. She had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. But she says she was still full of unforgiveness, so much so, and this is what she says, that it actually literally poisoned her body, and she ended up needing 27 operations. She doesn't go into detail what exactly the issue was. But suffering changed Rose, but not for the better, made her bitter and hateful, and it did give her a purpose. She actually wanted to kill the people that did this to them. I think I've got that up here. So yeah, what did suffering teach Rose? Self-reliance. She learned that she saw, oh, I can see it there too. Suffered because of Jesus, and she became bitter and hard, which is kind of the opposite to what the Bible tells us. So, and it's maybe kind of the opposite to what we sometimes feel when real suffering hits us. Maybe we feel the same. We feel self-reliant. We feel we suffer because God allows it. So how can we match that with what the Bible says? Fact is, there was something missing in Rose's life, and it's something that we also need to understand, suffering from a different perspective. Rose's daughter Miriam, when she was a teenager, she came home one day and she said to her Mom, I've become a Christian. And Rose says it was incredible, the kind of rage that came up inside her. And she said she couldn't stand being in the same house with her, so she actually told her to leave, go and live somewhere else. It was a teenage daughter. But she knew where she was staying with friends, and so she asked her husband, can you please go and check up on her that she's okay? So the husband goes, checks up on her, and he finds his daughter and her teenage friends praying together, and he was so touched by that sight that he joined them and became a Christian. And so he comes home a Christian too. The daughter moves back home, and then the younger daughter becomes a Christian too. And so here's Rose, hating all Christians, hating Jesus, surrounded by Christians. And she said, so when the daughters and the hutband had left for the day, like for school and for work, she would go through the bedrooms and she would collect everything that was connected to Jesus, so all the Bibles, and she literally would open the window and chuck it out the window into the bins underneath. But then a little while later, she actually started reading, opening a Bible. She went down to the basement so no one would actually see her do that. But she started reading the Bible, and she became more interested. And she asked questions, and she even went to a nearby college and sought out some lecturers and asked them some questions about the faith. And then eventually she was invited to a home group. She came along to the home group, they prayed for her, and then she prayed a prayer. And she prayed that if you're really if you're really the Messiah, I want you in my life, and I will do whatever you tell me to do. I will go wherever you tell me to go. And she said at that moment, it was like all the coldness and the heaviness left her heart, and it was as if a heavy burden was lifted off her shoulders. So suffering in itself is senseless, but because Jesus' suffering had a purpose and had a redemptive outcome, when we invite Jesus into our pain, into our life, then our suffering also can have a redemptive, a positive outcome and purpose. And it had a definite impact on Rose's life after that. So we'll just have a look at that. When after Rose had invited Jesus into her life, just need to grab a sip of water, she began to see that God was actually loving and kind and not what she had thought, like he didn't care about anything. And she learned that she could actually trust him, but she said it was a pretty hard lesson to learn, because for so many years she had believed that if she was to survive or even be successful, she would have to rely on herself. But she began to entrust her life to God, and she said it was a completely new thought, a completely new world. And even though she didn't really see it at the time, she began to realize that God had held his hand over her the entire time when she was in the concentration camps. Like that one time when she was standing in that line and someone pulled her back, she never saw who it was, if it was a person at all. But there was also the time when she stole a beet and hid it under her dress, and then they had to walk past guards. And she said she looked at the guard, and the guard looked at her, and she knew exactly he knew what she had done and that she was holding the beet under her dress. But he just let her pass, and she said that was completely out of character. She has no idea why he did that. But if he hadn't, he would have shot her on the spot. And then there was a time when, towards the end of the war, her sister Sarah developed typhoid, and she developed a really high fever and would have died without medication. So at night she took off to the infirmary, which to her great surprise was unguarded and unlocked. She went inside, the cabinets were unlocked, and so she grabbed all the bottles of medicine that she needed, and her sister survived. So God is there when we go through suffering. Very often we may not see it at the time because we're angry with God or feel he's left us alone, but he is there and he promises to be there with us. Isaiah 43, verse 2. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Now, when Rose understood that Jesus was not actually a killer, but the opposite, he was the Lamb, and he suffered and he died for us, she knew there was no way he would be in a Nazi uniform beating her or torturing her. She said she actually could see him in a prison uniform, suffering there right beside her. And in prayer ministry, this is what we often ask a person who has gone through a traumatic event. We ask the person, well, can you actually see Jesus in that situation with you? And if the person believes Jesus loves them and he's good, they can usually sort of say, yeah, I can see Jesus there with me. A few years ago, I had a very impacting short dream, and I've shared it before, but I just want to focus on this one facet, on this one aspect. And that was, in the dream I saw God looking out over the world, and he was just so heartbroken over the state of the world and the lost world. And then God was standing behind me, and he put a hand on my shoulder, and somehow through the touch we were emotionally connected, and I could feel all of God's grief and his grief over, I felt his grief over seeing his son Jesus die, and it was so deep. Like, I just started bawling. And I knew also that God could feel over that connection. He could feel all of my grief, he knew all of my sacrifices, and he felt all of my grief and all of my sadness. And so I know that God literally feels your pain when you're going through stuff. So Jesus joins us in the suffering. He suffers with us, but we also will join Jesus in all eternity. We know that there's a life prepared for us. So our perspective is not just on this short life, but it's wider than that. James 1:12. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. I came across a testimony by a wealthy businessman, Jim Woodford. He had a very good life, and then he fell ill with a disease that has no cure. He ended up in enormous pain, like all the time. And because he tended to take more and more pain medication, so much so that eventually he overdosed and died. And he had an experience of heaven. His wife was a Christian. He wasn't at the time. There are a number of things he sees in heaven, but there was this one time when he comes and sees his guardian angel reading a book, and there's a really impressive person standing opposite the angel. The angel is holding up the book for the other person to read it. And Jim says, I couldn't see the face of that person, but I knew it was Jesus. And I knew that was my book of life, and it was quite thin. And he said, I felt so embarrassed that for all of my success in life, and he said, I was a good person too. I gave to charities as long as I could get a tax receipt. He said, but all I had to show for it was this tiny, tiny volume. And so he said, and then he actually comes back into his body completely healed, and it changes him completely. And he says, now my purpose is no longer to make a lot of money and live a good life, but now I'm determined when I go back, it needs 3 angels and a forklift to lift my book. So he was successful and wealthy, and that's what he wanted to be because he grew up poor and without a dad. But knowing that there is eternal life with Jesus completely changed his purpose, and it allowed him to see that there is more to life. And maybe the most important thing is not to evade all suffering, but to focus on what we can do with our lives and the purpose that it has, that God gives it. So what counts in life is not just evading all suffering, but allowing for God to use all of our experiences, including our suffering, to use it for a good purpose. And Rose began to see that too, so she began to share her testimony, and she said, like, she was scared to speak in front of people, and she didn't even know how to hold a microphone. But through her experience, she did gain compassion. She had a lot of compassion for people who had gone through the same thing and people that were lost. And so she began to share her testimony, first at church in a small circle, and eventually at bigger and bigger events. And then she wrote the book. There are also online, there's interviews with her. And she says, Holocaust survivors often get quite angry with her because she's a Messianic Jew. But she says, I know exactly what they're feeling. So all I do is I give them love because I've been there too. In 1981, Rose was invited to speak at a conference in Berlin at the Olympic Stadium. So it was a huge event. And she agreed to go, but she didn't really want to go. She still had been a Christian for a while, but she still hated the Germans. She hated Germany. And she said she had prepared this long speech about how horrible the Nazis had been and what terrible things they'd done to her. But then she arrived, and as soon as she grabbed the microphone, she said, I don't even know what happened, but this message of forgiveness came out. And then after she had spoken, 6 men came up to her, and they said, we're so sorry, we're asking you to forgive us. We were, Nazis. And one of the men said, I was a Nazi guard in Dachau. Can you please forgive me? And she said, I listened to an interview, and she said, all she wanted to do was actually kill the guy. She said she had the thought, if I could just kill one of them. And her hands literally went forward to grab his neck. And she said some power actually took her hands back. And instead she said, Ich vergebe Ihnen, I forgive you. And she said at that point, she didn't even, she meant it mentally, but her heart wasn't in it. And she said it took her years to actually get to a point where she could say it and where she actually meant it too. But this guy that she said, I forgive you, he came up again the next day. It was a few days conference. And he said, this was the first day in 30 years that I've actually, or 40 years that I've slept soundly. He went on to become a street evangelist, and he saved prostitutes, children, runaway children, drug dealers. And Rose says, it's because of Jesus and what he's done for me that I can forgive. So back to our question at the start, is there a redemptive outcome to our suffering? Now, Jesus' suffering had a purpose and has a positive outcome. It had victory. He gained victory over sin and death, and he gained eternal life for us all. And because of Jesus, our suffering too can have a purpose and a positive outcome. We don't seek out to suffer purposely, but suffering is part of life. Don't let it make you bitter. This Easter, invite Jesus into your pain and allow God to use your suffering and your pain to turn it into a testimony and into a purpose. Amen.